Ladies and gentlemen, the captain has turned on the fasten seatbelt sign. If you haven't already done so, please make sure the volume of this podcast is set perfectly to your listening enjoyment. Please take your seat, whether that's on the treadmill, car, sofa, or bed, and buckle in for the last trip. My name is Jamie Beebe, and I'll be your tour guide, recreating someone's last days in paradise. On behalf of myself and everyone behind the scenes, please enjoy the Last Trip podcast. And because nobody likes a long flight to get to where they want to be, let's prepare for takeoff. The summer of 2008, 23-year-old teacher Hannah Upp was living in New York City when she suddenly vanished. There was no warning, no explanation, and seemingly no reason for Hannah to walk away from her life. Her family and friends had no idea where she had gone or what might have happened to her. As the days passed, strange clues began to surface, but instead of providing answers, they only deepened the mystery. Where was Hannah Upp, and how could a young woman simply disappear in one of the busiest cities in the world? This is part 1 of Hannah's story. To understand Hannah Upp's disappearance, it helps to understand the New York City she was living in. This was 2008. The iPhone had only existed for about a year. Smartphones weren't something everyone carried. Social media didn't create a constant trail of someone's movements. And there was no routine location sharing quietly documenting where you went throughout the day. Hannah lived in Hamilton Heights, a neighborhood in West Harlem on the west side of Upper Manhattan. It's an area of brownstones, apartment buildings, churches, and tree-lined streets that can feel surprisingly residential for New York. And much of Hannah's daily life was concentrated nearby. She taught Spanish at Thurgood Marshall Academy on West 135th Street in Harlem, and when she wanted to run, she could head toward Riverside Park, which stretches along the Hudson River on Manhattan's west side. Riverside Park gives you something you don't necessarily associate with Manhattan: space. Paths wind beneath trees, runners and cyclists follow the waterfront, and in places, the traffic and buildings can almost disappear behind you. And then there's the Hudson. It's not simply a scenic backdrop. The Hudson is part of a tidal estuary, meaning the water around Manhattan is constantly moving. Those currents, and where they eventually lead, will become incredibly important to Hannah's story. But there's something else about New York that matters here. You'd think a city filled with millions of people would be one of the hardest places in the world to disappear. There are people everywhere. Someone would spot you. But in many ways, it can be exactly the opposite. When everyone around you is a stranger, anonymity is easy. A woman in running clothes can walk for miles without attracting attention. She can sit in a coffee shop, enter a library, use a public computer, or spend hours in a park surrounded by people without anyone really seeing her. And Manhattan itself almost becomes a map of Hannah's disappearance. At the top is the life everyone knew: Hamilton Heights, Harlem, her apartment, and her school. Moving south, you reach Midtown and then Lower Manhattan. And at the bottom of the island, the city opens into New York Harbor. The Staten Island ferry crosses that harbor every day, leaving the skyscrapers of Lower Manhattan behind and traveling across open water towards Staten Island. Out there is Robin's Reef, marked by a small lighthouse, sitting almost strangely alone against the enormous New York skyline. Millions of people are only a few miles away. Boats pass constantly. You can see one of the largest cities in the world in the distance. And yet, in the water, you can be completely alone. That's what makes New York such an eerie setting for Hannah's story. She wasn't lost in a wilderness or stranded somewhere remote. She disappeared inside one of the most populated cities on Earth. A city filled with public spaces, transportation, bathrooms, libraries, parks, and endless crowds. Places where someone could potentially keep moving without ever having to explain who they were or where they belonged. In 2008, there were far fewer digital breadcrumbs to follow. New York was big enough for Hannah to be surrounded by people and still disappear. Before Hannah Upp became known for mysteriously disappearing, she was a daughter, a sister, a teacher, a traveler, and someone who seemed intensely engaged with the world around her. Hannah Emily Upp grew up with her brother Dan and her parents David and Barbara in Oregon. Both of her parents were ministers, and religion was woven deeply into their family life. They attended a Japanese-American church where Hannah's mother, an American woman who spoke Japanese fluently, was heavily involved in the church and surrounding community. One childhood friend would later describe Hannah as the princess of her church. This wasn't simply somewhere her family went on Sundays. It was Hannah's community and a major part of the world in which she was raised. But as Hannah grew older, her parents began moving in very different religious directions. Her father held particularly strict Christian beliefs, while her mother began gravitating toward a more progressive interpretation of faith. When Hannah was 15, her parents divorced. Her father, David, eventually devoted himself to missionary work overseas, traveling through Africa, Asia, and other parts of the world to preach and teach the gospel. Hannah, her mother, and her brother moved to Pendle Hill, a Quaker community outside Philadelphia. Suddenly, Hannah was being exposed to a very different approach to religion. Quakerism traditionally places less emphasis on hierarchy, ceremony, and ordained clergy, and more emphasis on equality and an individual's direct experience of faith. Hannah would eventually find herself more drawn to the Quaker community than some of the stricter beliefs she'd grown up with. But her evolving beliefs didn't mean she stopped loving her father. Hannah was still very much a daddy's girl, and the two maintained an unusual tradition. Roughly once a year, Hannah would travel internationally with him. Together, father and daughter traveled to 25 countries. So while Hannah grew up in a relatively small community, her view of the world became anything but small. By the time she was a young adult, traveling internationally wasn't intimidating or unfamiliar. She'd been doing it for years, and travel seemed to have affected her deeply. After returning from a trip to Ghana, Hannah wrote about the strange feeling of coming home and discovering that part of her was longing for the place she'd just left. There was something about immersing herself in another culture and another environment that seemed to resonate with her. Eventually, Hannah enrolled at Bryn Mawr College, a women's liberal arts college outside Philadelphia, where she studied Spanish and comparative literature. College became another period of change. According to reporting by Rachel Aviv for The New Yorker, Hannah arrived at Bryn Mawr as a creationist. But now she was surrounded by people with backgrounds, identities, and beliefs very different from the ones she'd grown up around. And Hannah began questioning some of what she'd been taught. During her junior year, Hannah came out to her mother and those close to her and began dating a woman. Her father's conservative religious beliefs made that difficult for him to accept. But despite their differences, Hannah continued visiting him and traveling with him. Their relationship may have been complicated, but she didn't simply walk away from it. People who knew her described someone who was incredibly energetic, sometimes so energetic that friends joked it was difficult to keep up with her. She was fun, athletic, and outgoing, and people genuinely seemed to enjoy being around her. She was also an excellent swimmer and in very good physical condition. And importantly, Hannah wasn't regarded as reckless or oblivious to danger. Her friends and family described her as intelligent and sensible, someone who was aware of her surroundings and understood that not everyone she encountered necessarily had good intentions. She also cared deeply about the world beyond herself. Hannah became interested in environmental and social issues and attended freegan meetings, where people discussed ways of reducing consumption and waste. After graduating from Bryn Mawr in 2007, Hannah moved to New York City and became a New York City teaching fellow. She began teaching Spanish at Thurgood Marshall Academy in Harlem, while also attending graduate school at Pace University. It was a demanding life for someone only in her 20s, teaching, graduate school, friendships, and adjusting to New York. But Hannah seemed excited about where her life was going. By the summer of 2008, she was 23 years old, living with roommates in Hamilton Heights in Upper Manhattan, and preparing to teach middle school Spanish. Her career was just beginning. And nothing about Hannah's life suggested to the people closest to her that she wanted to leave it behind. And that becomes important because of what happened next. In August of 2008, Hannah put on a sports bra and shorts and headed out for a run. But she didn't come back. On August 27, 2008, Hannah Upp left her apartment in Hamilton Heights and went out for a run. And she wasn't carrying much of anything. Her wallet was still at home. So were her passport, MetroCard, and cell phone. Hannah hadn't even taken identification with her. But Hannah was an adult who was perfectly capable of going somewhere on her own. As the hours turned into days, the circumstances became increasingly difficult to explain. Where was Hannah? She didn't come home. She didn't contact her family. She didn't contact her friends. And when the new school year began, Hannah didn't show up to teach. For the people who knew her, that was especially alarming. Hannah had been looking forward to the school year. Walking away from her job without saying anything didn't fit the person they knew. So her friends mobilized. Many of them were former classmates from Bryn Mawr, and they descended on New York to search. They printed roughly 1,000 missing person flyers and covered subway stations, bus stops, and signposts throughout the city. Some essentially moved into Hannah's apartment, using it as a home base while they organized searches and waited for news. But New York is an overwhelming place to search for one person. Millions of people move through streets and subway stations every day. Thousands of buildings, parks, alleys, train platforms, and neighborhoods stretching across 5 boroughs. Hannah could have been almost anywhere. And then, nearly 2 weeks after she vanished, something remarkable happened. Hannah appeared. Not at a police station, not at a hospital, and not at a friend's apartment. She was captured on surveillance cameras inside the Apple store in Midtown Manhattan. And she was still wearing what appeared to be the same clothing she'd left home in. A sports bra and running shorts, her brown hair pulled back in a ponytail. A man inside the store apparently recognized her from the news and approached her. He asked if she was the missing teacher everyone was looking for. And Hannah's reaction was bizarre. She didn't appear frightened. She didn't ask for help. She seemingly brushed him off and continued on her way. When Hannah's mother, Barbara, was brought to the police precinct to watch the surveillance footage, she knew immediately that the woman on the screen was her daughter. Barbara recognized Hannah's mannerisms, the familiar way she dismissed the man, as though everything was perfectly fine. And there was something else on the footage. Hannah used one of the computers inside the store to log into her Gmail account. She looked at the screen briefly, and then she walked away. She had access to her email. She presumably could have contacted anyone. But she didn't. Then there were other sightings as well. 2 days after the Apple Store encounter, Hannah was reportedly seen at Starbucks in Soho. But by the time police arrived, she had already left through the back door. Police also documented possible sightings at several New York sports clubs around Midtown, leading the detectives on the case to wonder whether Hannah might have been using the gyms to shower. And suddenly, the entire disappearance looked different. Hannah wasn't necessarily being held somewhere. She apparently hadn't left New York. She was moving through the city where hundreds of people were actively looking for her. So, was Hannah actually missing? Or had she chosen to disappear? And if she'd left intentionally, why walk away without her phone, money, or identification? Why was she apparently still wearing running clothes? Where had she been sleeping? How was she eating? And most confusing of all, if Hannah knew enough to access her own Gmail account, how could she possibly not know that everyone in her life was desperately searching for her? And her friends didn't know what to make of it, but the sightings gave them something they hadn't had before: hope. Hannah was alive. They began searching parks systematically, dividing maps into sections and sending groups to check wooded areas, running paths, and benches. Days passed, and then the sightings stopped. By September 16th, Hannah had been missing for 20 days. That day, a Staten Island ferry was traveling through New York Harbor when its captain noticed something in the water near Robbins Reef, which is a rocky area with a lighthouse south of the Statue of Liberty. From the ferry, it looked like the body of a woman, floating face down. Two deckhands took a small rescue boat out toward her. At that point, they believed they were going to recover a body. They reached the woman and pulled her from the water. And then she gasped. She started crying. The woman floating in New York Harbor was Hannah Upp, and she was alive. 20 days after leaving her apartment for a run, Hannah had somehow been found in the water near Staten Island. She was taken to Richmond University Medical Center, suffering from hypothermia, dehydration, and severe sunburn along one side of her body. But physically, Hannah was going to survive. And almost immediately, something even stranger became clear. When hospital staff asked who she was, Hannah could tell them. She knew her name. She gave them her mother's phone number. And Barbara arrived at the hospital within an hour. Hannah's friends came too. And when Hannah saw her roommate, she smiled. She was worried about getting out of the hospital because she needed to set up her classroom. Except Hannah didn't realize there was a problem with that. School had already started, weeks ago. From Hannah's perspective, almost no time had passed. Her last clear memory was going for a run in Riverside Park on August 27th. And then she was wet, sunburned, surrounded by doctors, and her mother was standing beside her. 3 weeks of Hannah's life were simply gone. And at one point in the hospital, Hannah woke up suddenly in the middle of the night and told her mother that she had been at a lighthouse. And then she fell back to sleep. When Barbara asked her about it the following morning, Hannah had no memory of saying it. That small detail became interesting because of where Hannah had been found. Robbins Reef has a lighthouse. And later, Hannah's brother Dan met with the Staten Island ferry captain and tried to reconstruct how Hannah could have ended up where she did. They studied the currents in New York Harbor and concluded that Hannah may have entered the water farther north, possibly in lower Manhattan, and been carried south by the tide. Based on her physical condition, Hannah and her family eventually came to believe that she had likely spent the night in the river. Her severe sunburn also raised the possibility that at some point she had managed to get herself partially out of the water, possibly near the lighthouse, before ending up back in the river. But that reconstruction could only explain the very end. It couldn't explain the previous 3 weeks. Hannah had apparently spent nearly 20 days navigating New York City. She had found food. She had apparently found places to shower. She had used a computer. She had crossed paths with strangers. She had been confronted with the fact she was a missing person. And yet when she was rescued, she remembered almost none of it. Doctors began trying to understand what could account for that extraordinary gap in her memory. And eventually Hannah would be diagnosed with dissociative fugue, a rare condition involving a disruption of autobiographical memory and identity. But giving it a name didn't suddenly explain those missing weeks, because Hannah still couldn't tell anyone where she'd slept. She couldn't explain how she'd eaten, and she couldn't say why she'd logged into her email without contacting anyone. And she couldn't explain how she'd ended up floating in New York Harbor. Those questions, and what Hannah herself would later remember about those 20 missing days, would make the story even stranger. What happened to Hannah was so unusual that even after doctors gave it a name, the explanation didn't necessarily make it easier to understand. After neurological testing failed to uncover a physical reason for Hannah's memory loss, doctors diagnosed her with dissociative fugue. At the time, it was considered a distinct psychiatric diagnosis. Today, clinicians generally describe fugue as a form of dissociative amnesia involving unexpected travel or wandering. In very simple terms, a person can lose access to the part of their memory that tells them who they are, but they don't necessarily forget how to function. They may still know how to walk through a city, use transportation, order food, speak to people, use a computer, or even hold down a job. Someone encountering them might have no idea anything is wrong. What is missing is their connection to their own personal story. The memories that tell them their name, their relationships, where they belong, and the life they were living before the episode began. That distinction is what makes Fugue so difficult to wrap your head around. Hannah wasn't unconscious for those 3 weeks. She wasn't lying somewhere in a coma. She was apparently walking around New York. She was interacting with people. She was making decisions. And yet, according to Hannah, the person doing all those things didn't seem connected to the Hannah who existed before August 27th. She later tried to describe that missing period in an interview with the New York Times. From her point of view, she had gone from taking a run to suddenly being inside an ambulance. Nearly 3 weeks of time had passed, but subjectively, it felt like almost no time at all. And that left an obvious question. What had Hannah actually been doing? Investigators, her family, and Hannah herself began trying to reconstruct those weeks. Almost like assembling a puzzle from pieces Hannah couldn't consciously remember. But there were clues. Bank records suggested there may have been a transitional period at the beginning. Hannah apparently slept at her own apartment for roughly 2 days while communicating with almost no one. Records also showed that she went to a movie in Times Square, something she had absolutely no memory of doing. And then she seems to have begun roaming. Her brother Dan later said the family believed Hannah may have retained some sense that people were searching for her without understanding why they were searching for her. Now imagine that for a second. You're walking through New York City and strangers seem to recognize you. Someone calls you by a name that may not feel meaningful. There are flyers with your face on them. People approach you and tell you that you're missing. But from your perspective, you don't necessarily understand what any of it means. Now, her family wondered whether that might explain some of Hannah's behavior. Why she brushed off the man who recognized her in the Apple store, or disappeared before police could reach her after later sightings. Dan described Hannah's fragmentary memories as a feeling of continually roaming, and the family wondered if, on some level, she felt as though she were being pursued without understanding the reason. But she also seems to have retained practical knowledge. A few months before she disappeared, Hannah had attended a Freegan meeting where participants learned about recovering edible food discarded by stores. Her family later wondered if those memories survived even when Hannah's personal identity didn't. It might explain how she fed herself without a wallet or money. They also believe she gravitated toward places she already knew, even if she couldn't consciously explain why those places felt familiar. And this is one of the strangest aspects of dissociative fugue. Memory isn't necessarily erased cleanly. Different kinds of memory can remain intact. A person might forget who they are while still remembering how to navigate a neighborhood, operate a computer, or perform everyday tasks. In Hannah's case, seemed to demonstrate exactly that. And then there were the fragments that only surfaced later. That strange moment in the hospital when Hannah suddenly woke up and announced she'd been at a lighthouse. But the next morning, she didn't remember saying it. But there was a lighthouse at Robbins Reef, near the place where she was eventually found. And after Hannah recovered, she and Dan retraced parts of the waterfront. When they reached Pier 40 in Lower Manhattan, Hannah told him that something about the location felt familiar. She had a vague memory of lights floating on the water. And Dan discovered that several days before Hannah was rescued, a Japanese floating lantern ceremony had been held there to commemorate September 11th. Now, that detail was especially striking because Hannah had grown up participating in Japanese American church communities. And as a child, she had taken part in Obon festivals that also involved floating lanterns. Her mother wondered whether something about that familiar ritual had registered in Hannah even when almost everything else about her identity had disappeared. The family eventually developed a possible reconstruction of Hannah's final days. They believed she may have returned to Pier 40 and entered the Hudson River. And Hannah had a vague memory of holding onto the hull of a barge and then realizing she was being pulled towards its propeller. If that memory was accurate, some instinct for self-preservation was clearly still functioning because she swam away. From there, she may have been carried south by the currents toward Robbins Reef. Her scraped knees suggested she may have climbed onto the rocks. The severe sunburn on one side of her body suggested she may have spent hours exposed there. And then somehow she ended up back in the water, where the Staten Island ferry crew eventually spotted her. But even that reconstruction only explains pieces of the story. There are still almost 3 weeks of Hannah's life that nobody can completely account for. Where did she sleep every night? What did she eat? Who did she speak to? And how far did she travel? Did she understand that the face on those missing person posters was hers? And why did this happen at all? Well, dissociative fugue is often associated with severe stress, trauma, or intense internal conflict. But that doesn't mean doctors can always identify a single triggering event. Because in Hannah's case, they couldn't. Doctors even tried hypnosis in the hope that Hannah might recover some memory of what happened immediately before the fugue began. Nothing emerged. Hannah herself started throwing out possibilities. Had she been hit by a car, mugged, assaulted? But there was no evidence she could point to for any of those scenarios. Her family said they weren't aware of a major childhood trauma that could provide an obvious explanation either. And that's important because the word fugue itself comes from the idea of flight or fleeing. Historically, psychiatrists often interpreted these episodes almost like a psychological escape, someone fleeing a situation or conflict that had become unbearable, even if they weren't consciously aware they were doing it. But if Hannah's mind had been fleeing something, Hannah had no idea what it was. There are documented cases where the traveling element becomes extreme. And one of the most famous involved a 19th century preacher named Ansel Bourne. In 1887, Bourne disappeared from Rhode Island and traveled to Pennsylvania, where he began calling himself Albert Brown. He rented a storefront and started selling stationery and candy. And apparently, nobody around him thought anything was particularly wrong. For roughly 2 months, Albert Brown simply lived his life. But then one morning, Bourne woke up and really had no idea where he was. He believed it was still January, when in reality it was March. Psychologist William James later studied Bourne, including through hypnosis, and the case became one of the classic examples in the history of dissociative fugue. Now, the resemblance to the fictional Jason Bourne is hard to miss, and Ansel Bourne's case is widely cited as inspiration for the character's surname and amnesia storyline. But real fugue isn't usually as cinematic as waking up fluent in 6 languages and discovering your secret assassin. It can be much quieter. Someone leaves. They travel. They behave normally enough that nobody realizes they don't know who they are. And then eventually, the fugue ends. Medical references describe episodes lasting anywhere from hours to months, and occasionally longer. Some people travel significant distances or establish an entirely different life before their previous identity returns. For Hannah, her identity seems to have returned almost instantaneously when she was pulled from the water. But that didn't mean she simply returned to normal. Her disappearance had become national news. People online questioned whether any of it was real. Some accused her of deliberately staging the entire thing. Hannah read those comments from her hospital room, and she was humiliated. At one point, according to people close to her, she even considered changing her name because she was so embarrassed by the attention. Eventually, though, she decided she didn't want to run away from being Hannah Upp. And I can understand why people initially struggled to believe the story. It's incredibly difficult to comprehend someone functioning for weeks without knowing who they are. But disbelief isn't evidence that Hannah invented it. Even one of the psychiatrists involved in Hannah's care later acknowledged how unsettling these cases can be because they challenge our basic assumptions about identity and consciousness. And Hannah continued seeing therapists for a period of time, but she didn't always find it helpful. She later felt that some clinicians were trying to make her experience fit neatly into an existing diagnostic box when, to Hannah, nothing about what happened felt neat. Talking with friends sometimes felt more useful. Because the diagnosis answered only one question: what do doctors call this? But Hannah was struggling with something far more personal. If she could spend 3 weeks walking around as someone who was technically Hannah Upp, but didn't know she was Hannah Upp, then who exactly had she been during that time? She later spoke about the strange guilt of being responsible for actions she couldn't remember choosing. How could she feel guilty for something she didn't even know she'd done? And yet it had still been her body, her decisions, her life. The experience forced Hannah to reconsider something most of us rarely have any reason to question. How much of our identity depends on our memories? Who was she before the fugue? Who was the person walking around New York during those missing weeks? Was that person still somehow part of Hannah? And who was she now? Those questions never received easy answers. But eventually, life began to move forward again. Hannah returned to teaching, she traveled, she maintained her friendships. And she tried to accept what doctors told her about the fugue, that for many people, an episode is isolated rather than something that repeatedly happens throughout their life. Clinical sources still describe reoccurrence as possible, but fugue itself is rare, and Hannah had reason to hope this bizarre 3-week disappearance would remain exactly that, one inexplicable chapter in an otherwise normal life. And for several years, that's exactly what it appeared to be. And then, Hannah disappeared again. Hannah's story raises a travel safety issue we don't talk about very often. What happens if you become disoriented and can't advocate for yourself? And for most of us, carrying a passport on a run or a quick walk would be unnecessary and probably a bad idea. But carrying some form of identification when you're alone is smart, particularly if you have a medical or psychological condition that could leave you confused, unconscious, or unable to communicate. The CDC recommends that travelers with relevant medical conditions carry information identifying that condition along with emergency contact information, and consider wearing medical alert identification. It also recommends leaving important travel information with someone you trust. And I wouldn't rely entirely on a phone for this. Phones die, disappear, and get damaged. A simple card in your wallet with your name, emergency contact, and essential medical information, or a medical ID bracelet can still speak for you when you can't. For anyone with a known history of memory loss, disorientation, or wandering, I'd take that step further and create an actual plan with family or friends. Share your itinerary, establish regular check-ins, keep a recent photograph accessible. Make sure the people closest to you know the places you're likely to go and exactly what information they should give police or medical personnel if you disappear. Technology can provide another layer of protection. Location sharing, GPS-enabled devices, and emergency features on phones and watches can make it easier for someone you trust to locate you. Although none of them should be treated as foolproof. And while dissociative fugue and dementia are very different conditions, some practical recommendations for people at risk of becoming disoriented can apply more broadly. The Alzheimer's Association, for example, recommends identification, emergency information, and planning around places someone might actually gravitate toward, including nearby bodies of water. Most importantly, if someone you love has a condition that could affect their memory or awareness, don't assume they'll necessarily look like they need help. A person can speak, walk around, and interact with other people while still being extremely vulnerable. And none of these precautions are meant to take away someone's independence. They're there to protect it. Travel, go running, explore a new city, and live your life. But if you know there's a possibility that you could become disoriented or unable to explain who you are, give yourself a backup plan. Because sometimes the smallest things, a name, phone number, medical ID, or someone knowing where you were supposed to be, can be what gets you home. After everything Hannah had survived, she tried to move forward. She returned to her life, continued teaching and traveling, and hoped that those missing 3 weeks in New York would remain a bizarre, once-in-a-lifetime event. And for several years, it seemed like they would. But Hannah's story wasn't over. Almost 5 years later, Hannah disappeared again. And once again, the people who loved her would be left wondering where she'd gone, what was happening inside her mind, and whether she would make it home again. So join us next week for part 2 of Hannah Upp's story. And finally, remember to leave a review and rate this podcast 5 stars if you like the show, or hell, even if you don't. But either way, feel free to let me know what you think. Please follow The Last Trip on Instagram at The Last Trip Crime Pod, and subscribe on Patreon to support the show. You'll get extra research, videos, photos, and updates, and even learn more about my personal travels. That's patreon.com/The Last Trip Podcast. I'm Jamie Beebe, bringing you your last trip and signing off until the next one. Thanks for listening.